Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alberto Vargas. I'm the Associate Director of LACIS, the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Is our second talk related to Cuba. Our speaker today is Denisse Delgado. Denisse is a Ph.D. candidate at the McCormack Graduate School of Public Policy and Public Affairs at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Her research interest focuses on international migration, remittances, and development. She's currently studying the Cuban diaspora, transnational economic engagement with the island, and has recently published broadly about these topics. Denisse is an active member of the International Organization for Remittances and Migration and the principal collaborator for Cuban Horizon at Columbia Law School. Denisse was also a research intern in the Migration, Remittances, and Development Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. And she has recently also been invited to present a congressional briefing about the impacts of Western Union closure on the Cuban people at the House of Representatives. Denisse has been a guest speaker at various universities, including Harvard University, University of Massachusetts in Boston, Florida International University, and here on our own University of Wisconsin in Madison. Please fill out the survey at the end of the talk and put your questions on the chat. Denisse is going to present today on a very timely topic on the COVID-19 pandemic, the Cuban economy, and remittances flows to the island. Welcome, Denisse.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you for these kind words and introductory comments. Good afternoon, everyone. I also want to thank Kristen and Sarah for all the technical support, and to the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program and the Institute for Regional and International Studies. I'm very happy to be here. I'm also seeing some familiar faces among the participants, the audience, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments at the end. This is the structure of my presentation. I am going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, the Cuban remittances flows, and the US, some restrictions on remittances, as well as new economic measures that the Cuban government has taken recently. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the economic context, just to show that the economic crisis is prior to the pandemic and the US restrictions. Then I will talk about the remittance flows to the island, both before and during the pandemic. Then I will touch on some US restrictions on remittance flows to Cuba during the pandemic. And finally, I will mention some of the new economic measures that the government has taken during the pandemic. And I will highlight what I think are some potentialities and other limitations. So you can see here this figure. The figure is showing the Cuba's annual GDP growth rates between 2004 and 2020. And we can see here that in 2019, there was a GDP contraction, and it was the first contraction for the Cuban economy since 1993, which was a previous economic crisis called a periodo especial. And last year, CEPAL estimated that the GDP declined in 11, which is a huge, it has a huge negative effect due to the pandemic. But let's recall first that the GDP in Cuba has been fed by mainly the exports of medical and other professional services, especially to Venezuela, who has in exchange provide some large supplies of oil to Cuba. And this is something that has been affected also during the last years. In a lesser degree, Cuba has also exported nickel, and the international tourism has played a fundamental role for the Cuban economy. Here we can see then the disaggregated indicators for the Cuban economy, and we can see how they have been diminishing during the last years. But here I want to focus more on remittances, which is the focus of this presentation. So we see that it had an increase, like there was a moderate increase since 2014 to 2019, and then a decrease in 2020. First, I would like to mention some methodological issues with the remittances calculation estimation. And it is related first that we don't have the official estimates from the Cuban government about the remittances that enters to the country. Second, there are some estimations that are calculated by US agencies that we don't know really what's the methodology that has been used. But my general sense is that during the last years, the remittance flows have been increasing on the island, and it makes all the sense that during last year we saw a decline on the amounts. Also, it also makes sense because we have a continuous migration from Cuba to the United States, and this is according to the census from 2010. The majority of the Cuban diaspora in the United States was living in Florida, then in California. There were also a community in New Jersey and New York, and finally in Texas. And here we know, based on the US Census from 2019, that there is around 2.3 million Cubans and descendants, Cubans who were born in Cuba plus their descendants living in the United States. And just in Miami-Dade County, there is around 1 million of Cubans. So they represent almost 80% of the whole Cuban community living abroad. And of course, this community send remittances to their family members, friends living on the island. And here we can see, this is from, it's an estimation from the Cuba poll, the 2020 FIU Cuba poll, which shows that almost 50% of Cuban Americans in South Florida send remittances to the island. And this is here I want to point to the two main ideas. First, while there is almost half of Cuban Americans sending money in normal times to the island, I think the average in Latin America is around 80% of the migrants sending money to their countries of origin, which is higher than what we have for the Cuban case. And also that, as you can see here, the ones who are sending, that say yes more frequently to send remittances are those who are the most recent arrivals and those who are non-citizens. They probably have a residency. But what I find interesting here is that those newcomers are the ones who has few resources and less economic stability, but they still managing to send money to their family members and friends on the island. So we see the impacts or the uses of remittances in two different levels. One is remittances as family consumption, but we also have been seeing how part of the Cuban diaspora send working capital. And they say, well, I'm sending remittances to help a family or a friend to develop a business in Cuba, which is not remittances in the traditional sense, but it's working capital. It's an economic help they are doing to support the development of the emerging private sector on the island. And in this case, I was talking to someone that I interviewed in Florida about the remittances as family consumption, and this person said that being able to send money to, he said, I'm being able to send money to my family in those first months I got paid was an unworldly thing, not to mention the first visit I made to Cuba, where I was able to pay a meal for my family and invite my friends out. And from my conversations and some polls that has been done, we see that they send around 150 or 200 monthly to support their family and friends on the island. The family and friends on the island use remittances mainly to cover and to solve basic needs such as food, transportation, to support for health and education. But we also know that in Cuba, the demographic pyramid is inverted. So that means that there are a great amount of elderly people, and some of these elderly people receive remittances to live and for family consumption, and some of them live alone. So remittances for them is a great support. And at the same time, as I have mentioned, we see the transactions of working capital. And in this regard, I also interviewed another person who said, I'm a computer engineer and sometimes I have clients that I cannot attend. And I asked a Cuban friend living on the island to make a web page or a web application for my client's business. So they earn some extra money and I don't lose my client. This is a way I help my friends in Cuba. So a part of the Cuban diaspora living in the United States is seeing the opportunity to capitalize this opportunity to support someone on the island, but at the same time, they help them to keep their work in the United States. And also there are some other people who, even though they do this through informal channels, they are supporting the development of restaurants or pubs or room for rents. And there are other people who also go to the island and bring especially technological gadgets and sell those gadgets there. And they find that is a way to capitalize as well. So it's kind of like an informal business. And here, according to the 2018 FIU Cuba poll, we see that the Cuban Americans who were interviewed in South Florida saw that if allowed, like they saw 50% of them saw that US citizens should be allowed to invest in Cuban businesses, and 46% of them saw that they would invest in their own private businesses on the island. So if they had the opportunity, they would do it in a formal way. But COVID-19 came, right? And it had like a lot of implications for a country who was already living in a situation with an economic crisis, with a decrease of tourism due to the restrictions on flights and imposed by the US administration during that moment. And when COVID-19 came, it had an impact also on the diaspora, who felt some experience unemployment affecting their economic capacity to support their loved ones on the island. But then there were people who tried to manage it to keep supporting their family members with their savings or the way they could. But they were affected. So the 2020 Cuba poll showed that 65% of all the respondents were financially affected. And we see here that among the most vulnerable are those who arrived after 1995, the newcomers. And we also know that with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Cuban government took some measures to control for the pandemic on the island, and among them were the restrictions on flights. So we also know that through flights, there is an amount of money that enters to the country through the mulas, which are informal channels, but due to the restrictions of the flights, the size of remittances, of course, declined on the island. And there we see the restrictions on remittances. So on top of that situation of the economic crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that the US have imposed restrictions on sending remittances to the island, but let's recall that this is a set of restrictions that come from previous years. So in 2019, the President Donald Trump's administration limited remittances to US persons to 1,000 per quarter to one close family member living in Cuba. And in reality, many Cubans who send remittances, they want to support the family as a whole, not just a family member, because as many of us know, it is common in Cuba that extended families live together. So it's very common that we see grandparents, cousins, uncles living together, and supporting just one family member is not on the intention of most of the senders. So they want to support the family. But in 2020, November to 26, then we saw another layer of these restrictions. We saw that Western Union, which is the leading remittance agency who has been operating in Cuba for decades, closed its operation on the island after the US State Treasury Department included FinCimex on the Cuba restricted list. And FinCimex is the Cuban agency that usually manages and administers the distribution of remittances in Cuba, and is part of the military sector. So the reason that the US Treasury Department gave to restrict FinCimex is that they wanted to remove Cuba's military from capturing fees from the remittance process. Nonetheless, I think this policy has had implications for the Cuban people, for the families, for the emerging private sector, much more than for the military sector. So we have here the families who have been trying to survive the economic crisis, and especially the elderly and the sick who are not able to receive this money that they used to, or to receive medicines. We know that there is a shortage in medicines right now in Cuba. People find it difficult to get access to antibiotics, to analgesics, and the closure of Western Union has also had implication for Cuban families who have been trying to survive in this difficult time. But it also has impacts on the private sector, on the emerging private sector on the island. And these words are from someone that I talked to before the implementation of the policy. And he said, the closure of Western Union will have an impact on my business because a Cuban who does not receive remittances will be a client that I lose. So he was foreseeing that he were going to lose clients because some of they go and pay for the service and products they provide with the remittances. And after the implementation, we have seen that it is a reality. So there is a report, a research that AUGE made, where 80% of entrepreneurs said that they have been seeing damages on their businesses after the Donald Trump restrictions. And in fact, 40% of them have asked for a suspension, a temporary suspension of their licenses for the businesses. So it is clear that it has had also an impact on the private sector. And at the same time, this is motivating more business and transactions in the informal channels. So in November 15 from 2020, we saw international airports were open in Cuba to regular commercial flights, and with the Cuban airports operating again, mulas came new opportunities to carry both the remittances but also other products on the island. So a common Cuban who was traveling to visit their family, their friends on the island could see that the airport was packed. And some people, like some anecdotal experiences I have heard, shows that people had to wait for their luggages for a week because it was not possible to carry all the luggage that was in the Miami International Airport. So mulas and people who wanted to make their annual imports to the country took that opportunity. So this is something interesting here because when the airport was closed, we saw through Rebolico, which is a kind of like something similar to eBay, where people buy and sell things. It's not from the state, it's independent. And you see that the prices are regulated by supply and demand. And when the airport was closed, people were selling gadgets and were selling things for a really high prices. When the airport opened again, we saw a little decrease on the prices, and when the restrictions for flights were implemented again, we saw the prices increasing again, but that was the opportunity for mulas to sell what they already imported to the country. And now, because the intersectionality of the economic crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the US restrictions on remittances, all this together, we have a really complex situation with impact at the macro level, as we saw for the GDP, but also at the micro level, where people are making really long lines to buy and to get access to the products they need. So we find a shortage of essential food and medicine. We see that it's difficult for people to get access to some products such as milk or chicken meat, things that are really basic in the Cuban diet. And other peoples are getting, even though the long lines are for the dollar stores, for the section of the Cubans who have access to the hard currency. So this is the situation we have now. And in the middle of that complexity, the Cuban government has taken new economic measures that are, it's not limited to this, but these are some of them: the elimination of the 10% tax on the US dollar, the opening of las tiendas con moneda libremente convertible, which people calls regularly like dollar stores, the expansion of the private businesses, and a monetary reform. But let's also recall that the Cuban government started the updating of the Cuban social and economic model in 2010-2011, where one of the main measures was the relaunch of the private enterprises on the island, el trabajo por cuenta propia, which would be in English self-employment. And now we are seeing an expansion of that cuentapropismo. One of these measures have been that Cuba has eliminated the 10% tax on the US dollar and have opened these stores. And in July, the Cuban was something announced in July, and some people have been since then using kind of a debit card called IEs. You can see here in the image. This is IEs for the transaction of dollars, but there are also IEs cards for Cuban pesos. And some people have been using the ICE cards to buy in the dollar stores, and the Cuban diaspora in different parts of the world have been using that also to make digital transactions to those cards, and to make it possible for digital dollars. So the ICE card is a product of Fincimex, and during the first months of the year, I know that people were using the ICE cards to buy household appliances, food, hygiene products, but then we know that, as we mentioned, the U.S. Department of State included Fincimex in the list of restricted agencies, and now it's difficult for those who live in the United States to use the ICE card to help their family members. There is a potential solution I have heard, that is that the Central Bank of Cuba has evaluated Western Union's interest in continuing the services on the island, and they are seeking to provide access through the REDSA, which is a non-military entity, so they can use the card. They manage the ITM cards in the country, and that might be a way to make it possible for REDSA to manage the flows of remittances that would Western Union use if they come back to the country. And we are also seeing the expansion of private businesses on the island. And this is something really recent. So in early February this year, the Cuban government announced the implementation of new measures as part of the transformation of the economic model. And this is called, well, we have here a list with more than 2,000 options, where we had a previous list of 200 something categories where people could work in the private sector. So now we just have like 124 categories of activities that are not permitted. So there is now a variety of options. I saw in the list mainly for construction, of course, room for rent and gastronomic sectors are also welcome in the list, and it has, in my view, a positive side, and it is that it expands opportunities. So there are people that are thinking now where they could be a private, like un trabajador por cuenta propia, instead of working for the state, because they have new opportunities now. But and it's also kind of like from the vision is it has a significance also because now the government is not saying, oh, you just can do these activities, small options for the private sector, but they are now saying you can do, but those are the ones that you shouldn't do. But the negative side of the expansion and these new measures is that there is still a restricted wholesale market, which is really needed to support the private sector. And again, people with mostly university degrees, such as engineers, architects, researchers, are not allowed to work in the private sector. So I think that with this new expansion of the private businesses, there are more updates and new measures that should come in the future. And finally, we have also the monetary reform, and some of the steps have been to eliminate the Cuban convertible peso, try to unify the exchange rate between the Cuban peso and the US the dollar. And first you need to do that, you need to devalue the Cuban peso right now The devaluation is you have 24 Cuban pesos if you want to get $1. And this is a great evaluation in a moment of economic crisis, but it's a needed step. Another moment is to modify the wholesale and retail prices and to eliminate part of products subsidized, and finally reform wages and pensions. And here, I have to say that I saw some people have received an increase in their salaries and also in the pensions. And there has been an incentive for some people to keep working in the state sector, and maybe in the future that might decrease the gap between the private and the state sector and the wages they have. But at the same time, the price of products has increased, so there is more inflation right now. And as Pablo Vidal, which is a Cuban economist, has said, I agree with him, that the real wage will not be possible this year due to the inflation. But I think that maybe in the long term, that might be possible. So the positive side of all this here, what I see is that the government is bringing some uniformity for the monetary system, because since 1990s, we saw that the state sector, the private sector, the Cuban people were operating with different exchange rates, which is not uniform. But now it would be possible for the government to have more transparency and also to see what are the companies that are not working well, that what are really competitive and which are need to be subsidized, and they will make their own decisions if they need to make more structures, more structural reforms. So I think that is a positive side of this and the monetary reform, but some negative might be that, well, the devaluation of the Cuban peso is happening right now in a very difficult time where the decision to make the monetary reform was taken. And another thing is that there is a parallel market, that is an informal market where the Cuban pesos is even more devaluated. So I checked today and I saw that if you wanted to get $1, you would have to give 50 Cuban pesos. So there are two, still there are two exchange rates, one official and the other one in the parallel market, in the informal market. And just to conclude, my final thoughts here are that before the COVID-19 pandemic, Cuba was suffering an economic crisis, and this crisis has aggravated as the remittances and tourism decline. Also, the US restrictive policies on remittances to Cuba adds another layer to the difficult situation Cubans are living on the island, and the Cuban diaspora at the same time has demonstrated that their economic engagement by sending remittances, but being interested in investment in private businesses on the island. And that I think this interest that have been demonstrated could be an opportunity for the Cuban government to normalize the Cuban diaspora's participation in process of economic adjustments on the island, provide some opportunities to make this formal. And this could also be an opportunity for Biden-Harris administration to support the Cuban people, who are the ones who have been suffering the most during the effects of the economic crisis. So with these ideas, I finished the presentation. Thank you.